Hello and welcome. My name is Nathan Hodge, and I'm a CNN journalist currently based in London. I was formerly the Moscow bureau chief for CNN and the Wall Street Journal. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on this insider's conversation on Russia's recent protest movements. My colleague Clarissa Ward had originally intended to moderate this discussion, but had to is on an assignment and has asked me to take her place. The Chicago Council typically does not have all-male panels, but in this instance, it was difficult to avoid. So before we get started, please also note that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan organization and takes no institutional policy positions. Views expressed by participants on the program are their own. If you have a question for the panel, we will be taking audience questions in about 30 minutes or so via ccga.live. Simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. So with that said, I'd like to welcome our two very excellent panelists to this conversation. We have Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's a Russian democracy activist, opposition leader, author, and filmmaker serving as chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom and vice president of the Free Russia Foundation. Andrei Soldatov is an investigative journalist, author, and co-founder of Agentura.Ru, whose latest book, The Compatriots, on the history of Russia's exiles, dissidents, and agents abroad, was co-authored with Irina Borogan. Welcome both, and thank you both for joining us. It's a great pleasure to see you both here. I wanted to start off really kind of on the news. I think it's very important that we touch on what the situation here, because the latest wave of protests obviously were prompted by the return and arrest of Alexei Navalny. And I thought Vladimir could really walk us through what the situation is now as he sees it, what the severity of the conditions are that he faces in prison, and what the way forward is for the protest movement. How serious of a challenge does this present to Vladimir Putin?
Thank you so much, Nathan, for moderating this conversation. I want to thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for bringing us here together. I've had the honor of visiting the council in person a few years ago when I was a guest lecturer at the University of Chicago, and I very much hope to be able one day to come back again in person to your premises. On your question, Nathan, I divided in sort of two different sub areas. One is what's happening with Alexei Navalny personally, and then the second is with the Russian protest movement more generally. To put it very concisely, the situation with Alexei Navalny is grave, dangerous, and deteriorating. Last week, his lawyers, Olga Mikhailova and Vadim Kobzev, were not allowed to see him when they came to visit him in the Pokrov IK number 2 penal colony. It's about 50 miles east of Moscow in the Vladimir region. They rang the alarm bells when that happened, because they had known, Alexei forbade them from making this public, but they had known that his health is rapidly deteriorating in the penal colony, and that the authorities are not allowing him not only to see the civilian doctors, but also to even get the medicines that are being prescribed to him. They finally were able, at the end of last week, the lawyers, to get access to Alexei. And what they saw was a man suffering from acute and constant back pains, not able to feel his right leg, hardly able to walk, finding it very difficult to get off his bed, and deliberately being denied medical care by the prison authorities. There was an open letter signed in the last few days by more than 1,000 doctors all across Russia that have called what is being done to Alexei Navalny as, I quote, deliberate torture, end of quote. This is a very serious and very urgent situation, and I think it's very important that the leaders of Western democracies speak out on this openly, publicly, and directly to Vladimir Putin. This is the only thing that can now help save the situation. Now, this sort of harkens some very horrible memories of deliberate mistreatment of past political prisoners, both in the Soviet Union and more recently in Russia under Putin. The names that first come to mind are Yuri Galanskov and Anatoly Marchenko, the authors, Soviet dissidents who perished in the prison system back in the 70s and 80s because of a deliberate denial of medical care. Of course, more recently, names such as Vasily Alexanyan, vice president of the Yukos Oil Company, and of course, Sergei Magnitsky, under whom the prominent, famous personal sanctions law is now called in the US, Canada, UK, and many other Western democracies. They both died as a result of being deliberately denied medical care while being held in this modern day Putin gulag. This is exactly what's been happening to Alexei Navalny now. The Kremlin, having failed to kill him through chemical weapons poisoning last year, is now slowly and painfully killing him in prison. And this must not be allowed to happen. This is, needless to say, against any kind of treaty or convention that the Russian Federation has ever signed up to. And it is absolutely incumbent now on the leaders of Western democracy, beginning with US President Joe Biden, to pick up the phone and do something about the situation. You know, President Biden recently prominently called Vladimir Putin a killer. It is now within his power to make sure that this list of victims does not grow by another name. And I hope this happens very soon. On the second part of your question, on the protest movement, now, of course, those two things are directly connected, because what is being done to Alexei Navalny by the Russian authorities in prison is a direct response from the Kremlin and from Vladimir Putin personally to the amazingly effective way that Alexei Navalny has been able to organize and lead the opposition movement, the popular anti-regime movement in Russia in recent years and in recent months. You know, his real crime, quote unquote, for which he's being held in prison is creating a political opposition in a country where one is not supposed to exist. Because the system that Putin has built, the system where the state controls everything, you know, from television networks to party registration to ballot access to any kind of political activity, that system should not allow for a political opposition, for genuine political opposition. I don't mean the clowns that are sitting in the Duma. And yet Alexei Navalny and his movement have managed to create one. And everybody saw the mass protest that took place nationwide all over Russia in January to denounce the arrest of Alexei Navalny, literally from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, all across the country, hundreds of thousands of people, despite these protests being quote unquote unauthorized. So everybody who went to that demonstration or to those demonstrations knew that they could be detained, they could be arrested, they could be beaten up, they could be expelled from university, they could be sacked from their job, and yet hundreds of thousands went. If we look at opinion poll figures, I always say this with a big caveat because it's difficult to speak meaningfully about opinion poll numbers in an authoritarian, unfree society where many people, first of all, lack access to objective information, but also are naturally hesitant, for obvious reasons, to share their political views with strangers. And yet, despite all of that, we see in an open-ended poll, the public confidence in Putin now down to 29%. That is astonishing for a dictator who controls everything, including all the major media. And if you take the younger bracket of respondents, people between the ages of 18 and 39, the figures of public confidence in Putin are even lower, and the clear majority do not want Putin to stay on in power after 2024, after his current and final term, final constitutional legal term, not counting the fake constitutional amendments passed last year, should end. And we even see this growing movement in election results, although that should be difficult in itself because we all know how elections are conducted in Russia under Putin. They're manipulated, they're fraudulent, they fully control the ballot access to make sure that genuine opposition candidates are not allowed onto the ballot. And yet, even when there's no real alternative, pro-regime, pro-Kremlin candidates are beginning to lose in a humiliating fashion to literally anybody, just some technical spoilers who happen to be on the ballot, as happened, for example, in the Moscow City Duma elections 2 years ago in 2019, where in nearly half of the districts, 20 out of 45, the pro-regime candidates were sent to humiliating defeats in the face of these political no-names who just happen to be on the ballot to imitate competition. And yet the Russian people are increasingly looking for imaginative ways to send a message to the Kremlin, and that is one of them. And of course, one of the main areas of focus for Alexei Navalny this year. We are now exactly, or even less now than 6 months away from the national parliamentary election, which will be held on September the 19th. One of the biggest areas of focus for Navalny and his movement is to repeat that humiliation for the Kremlin on the national level this September.
Thanks for an excellent overview of that. And I certainly want to follow up on a couple of those points, but I'd like to just turn very quickly, if I could, to Andrei, just to draw a little bit more on his expertise on the inner workings of the security services and their mindset and what kind of discussions they are having. What kind of affront do they see the activities of Navalny as being? We've seen a very harsh response from the authorities to street protests, but there's something let's say there's a sense, I think, from all observers that the gloves are off here, not only from the response of the protests, but following on what was happening in Belarus over the summer. Interesting enough, the timing of the poisoning of Navalny, also happening around the time that this concern was growing about what might be brewing in a neighboring republic. I thought maybe you might be able to give us a little bit more of an idea of what's the thinking inside of what we could call the deep state there.
Thank you, Nathan, for having me. Well, of course, it's a very good question because it looks like if you look at the numbers and if you look at what kind of threat to say political stability, how they call it, well, Navalny and his movement pose, you can see that actually it's quite striking that the response we see and we've been seeing for some time already is absolutely disproportionate to the possible threat Navalny potentially poses to the Kremlin. Well, it's absolutely impossible to understand if you try to think about this rationally. Look, why for instance, to try to kill him and to poison him last year, when, to be honest, 2020 was probably one of the worst years for the Russian opposition movement. By the summer, it was absolutely clear that because of COVID, well, Moscow and other Russian cities didn't see any protests, anything happening in response to the constitutional amendments proposed by Vladimir Putin. And the Russian population voted for these constitutional amendments and nothing actually happened. If you look at the numbers of how many people we got on the streets, even after Navalny was arrested, again, we are talking about probably 100,000 people, not only in Moscow, but in other cities, which is good, of course, but it's absolutely, well, incomparable with what we saw back in the beginning of 1990s, when Moscow was actually, had so many protests and it was about millions. And just to remind you that in Moscow alone, we have like probably 15, 60 million people living. And in comparison with this number of people, well, 100,000 people is not really that much and not that threatening. So why the Russian authorities and specifically the Russian secret services got so paranoid about Navalny that they decided to use all methods they have at disposal? I think the answer to that is that we still have the country and specifically the elites living in, I would say, in the past. They're actually locked in the past. If they try to understand what could happen to the country, they always try to look into what actually happened to our country in the recent past. And we have these two traumas, the revolution of 1917 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And both of these events are absolutely still, well, they are not really explained or reflected properly by Russian secret services. In 1917, well, the idea, the concept the Russian security services have, and I would say they inherited this concept from their predecessors in the KGB. We still believe that the revolution was done by a small bunch of revolutionaries who came to Russia from a foreign country with the help of foreign powers. Back when it was about Germany. And this small bunch of revolutionaries, they were able to destroy this mighty Russian empire with probably the most powerful secret police in the world. And it was absolutely unprecedented. It was not expected. It was not prevented by the guardians of the political regime. And the idea, the image that something like that could happen again, that a small bunch of revolutionaries or emigres could get back to Russia with the help of some country. And with Navalny, it literally looked like a repetition of 1917 because he came to Russia from Germany, the same country. So that triggered all this paranoid reaction for the Kremlin and for the Russian secret services. The 1991, again, still completely unexplained and not properly reflected. And the people on Lubyanka, they do not understand how it happened and how it could possibly be that the Soviet Union, this glorious, powerful country, with the KGB, the most powerful secret services in the world, was destroyed in 3 days. And that gives them a feeling that they cannot tolerate any kind of dissent movement, because anything, even a very small thing, small protest, really tiny opposition movement could trigger something which finally, or maybe very quickly, could get us to the point when the country would collapse and the political regime would fall and the Kremlin would be stormed by I don't know who. And I think that this strange perspective, historical perspective, which dominates the thinking of people in the Russian security services, this explains what actually happened and why they are so brutally responded to Navalny's return and to the protests which followed.
Very valid point. I think on the Bolsheviks were a conspiratorial organization, and that paranoid worldview persists to this day. But talking about 1991, I had the occasion to look back at a photo of one of those famous photos of Yeltsin standing on a tank, and who's up there as well, but Viktor Zolotov.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Who is today the head of one of Russia's what we call Rosgvardia, it's the National Guard, one of the organizations actually created for cracking down on domestic dissent and with sweeping powers to do so. Who has a personal enmity with Alexei Navalny, and I think at one point personally threatened to turn him into a juicy beefsteak in a video that he released. So it's certainly personal as well, but you also see that that they perceive these threats to their institution. But I'd like Vladimir maybe to speak a little bit, because we've drawn some parallels to the dissidents of the past, and we see these unhappy or very morbid, actually, echoes of the past. But there are things that are quite different today for the Russian opposition, tools that were not available to the dissidents, everything from what Andrei has written about the internet, to new tools for organizing, plus new forms of investigative journalism, something that Navalny himself is doing, that allow, but it would be unthinkable for a dissident to be able to fly a drone over the property or the alleged property of members of the Kremlin inner circle or the elite. So there are new tools that are out there, and I thought maybe Vladimir might be able to talk a little bit more about what's different today.
Thank you, Nathan. And I just want to add two brief things. First of all, you mentioned Viktor Zolotov and his personal animosity to Alexei Navalny, well known and well publicized. It's also important to mention that General Viktor Zolotov was very likely involved in a chain of command going from Kadyrov's people all the way up to Vladimir Putin that were involved in the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov in February of 2015. If you read last year's OSCE oversight report on the Nemtsov assassination, you will see the name of Zolotov mentioned there several times, just as the names of Kadyrov, Delimkhanov, and of course Putin himself. That's a report that's publicly available. I'd recommend that people read it just to see the reality that we live in Russia today. If you Google OSCE Nemtsov report, that's the first thing that comes up. It's published on the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly website. And the second thing, as we are speaking now, the news just came in 5 minutes ago that Alexei Navalny has gone on a hunger strike in the penal colony with a demand to get access to medical care. And this indeed is a horrific echo going back to the times of dissidents in the Soviet Union. Nothing is new under the sun. It just seems that very often Russian history goes in these circles, and this is sort of the part that we're now in. But of course, that also goes for what Andrei Soldatov was just talking about how that totalitarian, massive system of repression went down in just 3 days in August 1991. This is how things happen in Russia too. And so when I hear today people, including eminent, Western Russia analysts, speak about how Putin's regime is stable, how it's going to last for a long time, I sort of remember those Western criminologists in the early 1990s who were saying the same thing about the Soviet regime, and then it went down in 3 days. So let's just keep that historical perspective in mind. So maybe some of those things that that Putin's security services are paranoid about actually have some ground to them. And it's, if you know Russian history, you certainly could think that is the case. On your question, Nathan, on the sort of the modern technology and how that affects what we do, Vladimir Bukovsky, one of the most prominent Soviet era dissidents, once said that if we had the internet in 1970, there would not have been a Soviet Union by 1980. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's certainly an important point in that. Is that this modern technology gives us the tools to counteract and stand up to this massive machine, for example, of government propaganda. You alluded to the Navalny documentary film about Putin's palace on the Black Sea coast. As of today, that documentary film has been watched 115 million times. There was a survey, I think from the Levada Center, that came out last week that showed that 28% of Russian households have watched that film. That is amazing. That's actually more than the combined audiences of state-run television programs. These sort of propaganda exercises led by people like Vladimir Solovyov and Dmitry Kiselyov that spew hate every evening on millions of Russian television viewers. Well, now the audience of the uncensored online information space is actually comparable to that state-controlled propaganda machine. And that, I think, is a very important factor that in the end does not play well for the people in the Kremlin. I think they made a big mistake from their own point of view, of course, not from any normal human point of view. But, the Chinese dictatorship began to control the internet and to sort of introduce these censorship measures, technological censorship measures, as soon as the internet appeared, basically. And so the censorship tools grew with the internet itself. And so today, I suppose for a lot of people in China, it's sort of a natural way that's how the internet operates, with those restrictions, with those, what is it called, the Great Chinese Firewall, right? The Kremlin missed that, and thankfully. And so today, they went after traditional media outlets. The first thing Putin did when he came to power 21 years ago now, was go after independent nationwide television networks. NTV, TV6, TVS, those are all destroyed, either shut down or taken over within 3 years, the first 3 years of Putin being in power, by the summer of 2003. So they definitely went after the traditional media outlets, but they disregarded the internet to their own peril, I think, in the long term. And now we have between 75 and 80 million people in Russia who are daily users of internet. A lot of people now use it as a source of information. And it's just not possible to momentarily introduce all those measures that the Chinese dictatorship has worked for decades on. And so I think that information space in the long and even in the medium term, I think, will be an important factor of change in Russian society.
That reminds me of an excellent anecdote, I think, in Andrei's book. I believe it's Red Web, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Sort of as Swan Lake is playing on state television during the 1991 putsch against Gorbachev, there was a node of communication with the outside world through the internet. Russia's the Soviet Union's first outpost of the not the web, it's before the World Wide Web, of the internet. Russia, like Vladimir pointed out, as much as the Kremlin would have liked to have reproduced the Great Firewall, there are millions of YouTube users who would be very unhappy if Masha and the Bears was taken away. That horse is out of the barn. But there have been, and I think Andrei could speak to this, efforts to crack down through this effort to create a sovereign internet. And what significance does he see in efforts to limit internet freedom, to more tightly control the internet in Russia? And how much of a threat is this? Is there a kill switch, so to speak, that is available?
Yeah, it's a very complicated and partly optimistic, partly very pessimistic story. We've been living under some sort of censorship, online censorship, since 2012. And the previous big offensive on internet freedom started right after the previous wave of protests, which took place in Moscow and some big cities in 2011, 2012. And after that, the Kremlin and Russian internet censors, they tried many tricks. Some worked, some didn't work at all, trying to suppress freedom of expression online. And to be honest, they made several mistakes. For instance, they introduced a very brutal but absolutely primitive and ineffective system of internet filtering. Nothing comparable with what we see in China. It's mostly about blocking particular websites and IP addresses or pages. It's absolutely incomparable with what we see in Beijing. Then you have specific words marked by the system, and then you have these posts or pieces or videos taken down automatically. In Russia, it's still absolutely available, and you can find a way and to reach and to get access to information you want to read or watch. And most of global platforms, actually all of them, they're still available, including Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. But of course, about 8 years passed, almost 8.5, and I would say that the Kremlin finally, they learned some tricks, and now we are in a very precarious situation right now. I don't think it's just a coincidence that right after the protest, the most recent wave of protest, we got an attack on Twitter, and actually the Russian authorities gave Twitter just a month to comply with the request of the Russian authorities. But basically, it's about to fall in line with the Kremlin and to agree to cooperate with the Kremlin. And if, say, Twitter would say no, it might be blocked permanently. Now it's the traffic of Twitter is already slowed down, and despite some problems and setbacks in the beginning, which were quite interesting, that they blocked the website of the Kremlin itself and the Russian government, but nevertheless it didn't stop them, and they persisted. And well, lots of people in Moscow and other cities, they took it as a sign that the Kremlin is ready to go and to apply more drastic measures and maybe to go after other global platforms. The other problem is that, to be honest, there is an exchange of opinions and techniques and methods between Russia and China these days. And internationally, you can see that they use exactly the same language. They talk about digital sovereignty all the time. They push for similar initiatives at the level of United Nations, for instance. But domestically, they try to use or to apply the tricks which worked in their countries. And it might be the new stage for us, for all of us this year and the year after. For instance, now what we see right now is Russia is trying to introduce a new concept of forcing Russian users to live in a bubble of Russian-made applications. They finally got it, that the most dangerous content online is generated not by Radio Free Europe or State Department, somewhere abroad. It's generated in the country. When you see some crisis happening, when you see some natural catastrophe, or you see some beatings on the streets, or you see some protests, like we saw, for instance, 2 years ago in Ingushetia, these videos recorded by ordinary users, they tend to provoke more reaction from ordinary Russians than anything recorded by, again, Free Radio Europe or Voice of America. So the Kremlin understood that we need to do something with the activities of ordinary Russians who might be prompted by something happening just next door to post videos or text or just something online which might be deemed harmful for the Kremlin. And they created a system which would let them to, kill the internet connection to a particular region or from a particular region, the famous kill switch. But the idea of this kill switch is not to, isolate the country as a whole. That's absolutely impossible. And people in the Kremlin, they sort of understand that. They understand they're too dependent on the internet. but we want to have an option to switch off the connection in a particular region if something is going on there remotely from Moscow. And they built a special facility in Moscow by now, and we tried this system on Twitter. And as I said, at least partly, it was absolutely effective. And we also introduced it with new legislation that's coming into force actually tomorrow in April. And the idea is to have all smartphones sold on the Russian territory with pre-installed Russian-made applications. And the idea is to have all Russian users to live in a bubble of Russian-made applications, to get used to them. So if something happens, even if something happens, with Russian users, not activists, not people like Vladimir or his friends, but just ordinary Russians, they would turn to what they use in their ordinary lives, the applications they use every day. And from April on, they would be using Russian-made applications. And these applications and the services provided by Russian companies, they are already under control of the Kremlin. So let's see how they work in a year, maybe two. But unfortunately, this model proved to be quite effective in China and might be a bit more effective in Russia too.
Thank you. And I just want to remind all those who are viewing us live that if you go to ccga.live, you can send in some questions. And I'd like to just turn back to Vladimir and summarize a few of the questions that are coming in. In particular, I'm seeing a couple of questions about whether bringing EU or US pressure to bear can make a difference. And as well, I think we've spoken again about the parallels to the dissident movement in the past. But we don't have a situation here where we have where Russia is cut off from the outside world, but state television has done a fairly good job of blackening the name of opposition leaders like Navalny. The previous tactic was just not to mention his name at all, sort of he who cannot be named. But there was enough, I think, media attention, and Vladimir mentioned the extraordinary number of page views that his investigation of the Black Sea Palace had received. Suggests that despite this kind of media blackout, it is breaking through. But so it's kind of a twofold question back to Vladimir, but Andrei, feel free to jump in as well. How effective has this old-fashioned form of state control of media been in, let's say, enforcing conformism and creating a general climate of fear around joining in with protests, giving people the sense that they might be aligning themselves with someone who's been alleged to be, let's say, a foreign agent or works for a foreign intelligence agency? And likewise, what kind of pressure is effective in this world? We've already seen a raft of sanctions over the past 5 years since Crimea, the introduction of the Magnitsky Act. Does the Kremlin care?
Well, I start with thank you for those two very important questions. I'll start with the second part on the media landscape. Now, as I mentioned, independent media were the first target of Putin when he came into power. In fact, we have this Russian saying, "Кто нас обидит 3 дня не проживет." Those who will offend us won't survive for 3 days, something like that. Almost in the exact keeping with that saying, on the 4th day after his inauguration as president in May of 2000, Putin sent armed operatives from the Prosecutor General's service and the tax police to raid the offices of Media Most, which was at that time the largest independent media holding in Russia, the parent company of NTV, the most popular privately owned nationwide television network that was known for its hard-hitting news coverage, political satire, sharp criticism of the authorities, including the wars in Chechnya. In fact, today, March 31st, is exactly 20 years since the mass rally in support of NTV on Pushkinsky Square in Moscow, March 31st, 2001. Public pressure didn't help then, and NTV was taken over in April of 2001. TV6, another nationwide independent TV channel, was shut down in January of 2002, and TVS, the last independent nationwide television network in Russia, was switched off the air in June of 2003. So that was the first priority for Putin, to silence the alternative voices in the media. And for a while, in fact, for a long while, for many years, this helped cement complete control of the agenda, of political life, of public life, because for a long time, terrestrial mainstream national television networks were the main source of information for the vast majority of Russian citizens. That is much less the case today because of the modern technology that we were discussing, Nathan, with your previous question. Those state TV channels are just as controlled from the Kremlin today as they were at the beginning of Putin's rule. In this sense, nothing has changed. In fact, the propaganda has got more intensive, sort of more hateful, more aggressive. In fact, I try to avoid watching those state TV programs just because I value my nervous system, and I wouldn't recommend anybody does it unless you need to do it for professional reasons. But that now has a limited scope just because of the emergence, well, first of all, of new technology, but most importantly, of the new generation. Those young people that I see often when I go, not just in Moscow, a lot of my work is out in the regions when I go and hold public events around different cities and different regions of Russia. I see young people, people below the age of 30 or below the age of 25, and you can no longer tell the difference between, what we used to, maybe there's a little bit of a Moscow snobbery here in me, but, before you used to always be able to tell the difference between an audience in Moscow and St. Petersburg and, what we call the provincial audience. This is no longer the case with the young generation because, they use the same gadget, they watch the same YouTube videos, they use the same Twitter and Facebook and the social media. This is the new modern European Russian generation. They do not watch state television. It's not that they don't trust it or are not influenced by it. They just don't watch it. They don't care about it. And so in this sense, Nathan, what you said about, for example, to use Alexei Navalny and this sort of continuous propaganda drumbeat against him, sure, that still works for, I don't know, maybe about 35% of the population who are still confined to that state television for their news coverage, but that does not work anymore for vast swathe of Russian population now, especially the young people. And if you look even at the Levada Center opinion polls, and if you look at the sort of public sentiments of that young generation between the ages of 18 and 25, and even more generally between the ages of 18 and 39, you'll see that's vastly different from, let's say, people 55 and up. And that's because of this information gap, because of those different sources of information that people use. And even a lot of those people who do watch state television, those messages that they hear about Navalny, that he's an enemy, that he's a traitor, that he's a foreign agent, a lot of people still have that sort of reflex from Soviet era. Listen to what you're being told in state television, and the reality is actually the reverse. So don't discount that as well. So I wouldn't overblow the effect that state propaganda is having on people today in the year 2021, as opposed to, let's say, 2004 or 2005, when it had a near total effect. Things are vastly different just because so much time has passed. And on your second question about what can the West do, what can EU and US and Canada and the UK now separate from the EU do? Well, again, I would divide this into two different areas. So specifically when we're speaking about the fate of political prisoners, we know, and that's a matter of historical record, that high-level personal advocacy on the part of Western leaders have actually helped secure the release, the freedom and the lives in many cases of political prisoners, both in the Soviet Union and more recently in Russia under Putin. Back in the Soviet Union, political prisoners like Vladimir Dzhemluga, Vladimir Bukovsky, Alexander Ginsburg, Yuri Orlov, Anatoly Sharansky, and I can continue this list, were released from the Soviet Gulag because of personal advocacy from Western leaders, including from US presidents of both political parties. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were particularly known, both of them, for engaging in personal advocacy in support of Soviet political prisoners. In more recent years, Mikhail Khodorkovsky would not be free today without personal advocacy by Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, and Oleg Sentsov, the Crimean film director, would not be free without personal advocacy by Emmanuel Macron, the President of France. Those are two, I'm just stating the facts here. And so when we talk about specifically political prisoners, then personal interventions, personal advocacy by Western leaders can actually literally make the difference between life and death. And this is why I want to again reiterate that it is so important that those heads of state and heads of government of Western democracies pick up their phones and now personally advocate for Alexei Navalny, whose not only freedom, but whose life is now at stake. Again, he's just gone on a hunger strike about 40 minutes ago, announced it publicly because of the deliberate denial of medical care that he's being subjected to in a penal colony. In a more general sense, it's a sort of an important philosophical question of how much the West can do to help the cause of democracy and human rights in Russia. You know, one of the constant sort of lines and lies of the Kremlin propaganda machine is that people like my colleagues and myself, you know, Russian opposition leaders, Russian opposition activists, that we go to the West and that we ask the West for support, for political support, or for money, or we ask them to effect regime change in Russia. You know, whatever other nonsense these people come up with. Of course, as I don't need to tell you, none of that is true. You know, just last week, I was assaulted, not for the first time, at the Domodedovo airport in Moscow by a crew from NTV. Now, it used to be the symbol of independent media in Russia. Now it's sort of the symbol of this base, hateful Kremlin propaganda. And, you know, coincidentally, they always know the flights we're taking, the trains we're taking, and everything. I wonder how that happens. But so they jumped at me at Domodedovo airport, camera in my face, you know, why are you selling out your motherland to the US State Department or something like this? And that's the constant line. Of course, that has nothing to do with reality, as I don't need to explain to either of you. Only Russians can and should, and I may add will, change the political situation in our country. It cannot and it should not be done by anybody from the outside. The only thing we actually do ask of Western democracies, of the EU, the US, and other Western powers, is that they stay true to their own values, that they stay true to their own principles, that they stop being complicit in the Putin kleptocracy by allowing the oligarchs and the senior officials from the Kremlin who abuse and attack the most basic norms of the rule of law and democracy and human rights in our country, in Russia, but then who come to the West and have their bank accounts in the West and their second homes in the West and spend their vacations in the West and send their wives and their mistresses on shopping trips in the West and so on and so forth, because this is complicity. This is enabling on the part of those Western governments that allow these crooks and their dirty money to be stashed away in Western jurisdictions, you know, by people who want to steal in Russia and then go and spend and stash away that money in the West. Nathan, you mentioned the Magnitsky Act. That is one of the most crucial tools in this whole area. The Magnitsky Act, of course, is a mechanism that imposes personal targeted sanctions in the form of visa bans and asset freezes on those individuals who are complicit in human rights abuses and corruption in their own countries, but then want to come and enjoy all the privileges and benefits of democracy in the West. This is what the Magnitsky mechanism stops by banning such people from obtaining visas, owning assets, or using the financial and banking systems in those Western countries, those Western jurisdictions. I've spent now more than 10 years working on advocating for this legislation. I'm proud to say that this legislation now exists in all the major jurisdictions of the Western world, the US, Canada, the UK, the Baltic states, and as of last December, throughout the totality of the European Union. And so it will be very important to see Western governments and Western democracies actually use that mechanism to say that those crooks and those abusers will no longer be welcome on Western soil and in Western banks and in Western financial jurisdictions. This is in the end all we want from the West. Stand true to your own values and do not enable the corruption and kleptocracy and human rights abuses that the Putin regime perpetrates.
I would just add to what you had said, that there are people that we know in Putin's inner circle who present themselves as defenders of traditional values, yet also enjoy property and wealth that's stashed in Europe, while presenting Russia and Putin's leadership as a bastion against, Putin has presented himself as the arch foe of liberalism, or that the idea of liberalism is dead. Some of the people who work as propagandists for Russian state television have residence or enjoy second homes in Europe. So
in the case of Vladimir Soldatov, you have two second homes. He has two villas on Lake Como in Italy and holds a residence permit. You're absolutely right. And there are many examples. We can go on for a long time about this. Astonishing hypocrisy.
Andrei, I thought I would want to turn back to you. You had mentioned a very interesting story, and that was in Ingushetia. I thought that was it was reported, and then it was a difficult story to report because of the kind of shutdown that you saw, or attempts to shut down information getting out of this out of the North Caucasus, but we also saw what was happening in the Russian Far East as well last year. What kinds of could you just enlighten us a little bit more on where you see how this develops in the regions as well?
Yes, it's absolutely fascinating story. But first we saw this protest which go for months and years in Ingushetia over the dispute with neighboring Chechnya, and some fascinating scenes from where people on horseback protesting, taken to the streets in the center of the capital of Ingushetia. And then we got this protest in Khabarovsk and some other cities, and it was absolutely unpredicted by the authorities or by the opposition. And it was, of course, a sign of what Vladimir was talking about, that this monopoly on information, which the Kremlin enjoyed for almost 20 years, is cracking down now. But on the downside of this thing is that the Kremlin and people there, they're probably not genius, but they're not stupid. And we got it that by now, by 2021, people, ordinary Russians, they are getting tired of all this patriotic hysteria about the annexation of Crimea or our war over traditional values with Europe or the United States. And it's not enough to keep them under control. And the Kremlin unleashed the new tactics of selective repressions, targeting the elites. And that is absolutely fascinating, and it's absolutely horrible. Every month we get news that another governor or minister or some high-level official was sent to prison. We have people from security services in prison. Even a general of the FSB, is the most trusted security agency by Putin himself, got arrested and actually charged with some crime, and that horrified lots of people in the Kremlin, in the elites, in the country and beyond. And I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's a new development. Our recent book, The Competitors, was about the tricky relationship between the Kremlin and the Russians abroad. And for that, we did the research and talked to many people who live in the country and abroad, to oligarchs who fancy themselves to be global and international and not very dependent on the Kremlin. But it turned out it was not the case, and it is not the case. For instance, I remember that I went to the interview with Alexander Lebedev, who is the father to Yevgeny Lebedev, who was promoted by Boris Johnson to be a lord, a peer in the British Parliament recently, the very first Russian to get this honor. And Alexander Lebedev is a very smart guy who, through his son, owns 2 British newspapers, and who else could be seen as a global Russian, international Russian. Lebedev also, he has some background in the KGB, so he perfectly understands the rules. He absolutely understands how to play this game in the country and abroad. And I remember when I asked him about Vladimir's situation, and I just wanted to remind our viewers that Vladimir Kara-Murza was poisoned twice. He was poisoned in 2015 and by some miracle survived, and he was poisoned in 2017 again. So I asked Lebedev about these poisonings, and Lebedev was horrified. He asked me, he just shot at me some questions about Novichok when he attacked the Russian opposition. He said that there is not such a thing as an opposition, so why to care and to poison them? Then he attacked the very idea that somebody could be poisoned in Russia. So it was a classic denial of everything. Like, there is no opposition, there is no poisoning, there is nothing to do with political repression in the country. He was visibly horrified. And you think, if these kind of people are horrified by what the Kremlin is doing, including the poisonings in the country and abroad, it means that the tactics of intimidation still works, even if we see that the Kremlin might actually do some really sloppy things and stupid mistakes, and you get Russian operatives caught everywhere, from Bulgaria to Britain I think it's today we got 2 Russian spies caught in Italy, but nevertheless, the very sloppiness of these operations and brutality sends this very, I would say, strong message to people in the country and abroad. But these people are, they are ready to take these risks and to do whatever we want. And it horrifies a lot of people, and it's still effective.
We just have time for some closing remarks. So very quickly, Vladimir, if you could give us a few thoughts on what you think the way forward are. We've gotten a very excellent overview, but your thoughts about what you think the next few months hold for us.
Well, I think, and I'm saying this as a historian by my first education myself, I think one of the things that modern Russian history teaches us is that major political changes in our country can happen suddenly and unexpectedly, including for their own participants. When in 1904, the Tsarist interior minister, Count von Plehve, boasted about the need for a small victorious war to sort out the domestic problems of the empire, I don't think he anticipated that just a year later, largely as a result of that war, that turned out to be not so small and not so victorious, that was a war against Japan, Russia would be engulfed in its first revolution, and the Tsar would be forced to concede a parliament and political freedoms. When Lenin spoke to a group of young Swiss social democrats in Zurich at the end of January 1917, he ended with a famous phrase that my generation will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution. The Tsar abdicated 6 weeks later. And I'm old enough myself as a child, but when a revolution happens in front of your eyes, you tend to remember it. I'm old enough to remember August 1991, when one of the most repressive systems in the history of humanity went down in 3 days. And nobody at the beginning of August of that year predicted that by the end of the month, the Soviet regime would no longer exist, and that by the end of the year, neither would the Soviet Union itself. So that's just a note of caution to those who think that Putin is stable, Putin is forever, or that he's just perpetuated his rule with these fake constitutional amendments that are completely illegitimate, by the way, that were passed last year under the cover of the pandemic. And so one of the biggest sort of areas of work and focus for us in the Russian opposition is to actually start laying some groundwork and start preparing for that future change. We don't know when or how precisely it's going to come, but we know that it will. And one of the most important things we can be doing now is to help prepare that young generation for that task ahead in all the sort of educational and training programs that we're engaging in. I think that's probably the most important thing that we can be doing right now, and that's what we are focusing on doing. On the international side, I mentioned a couple of times in passing these constitutional amendments that Putin rammed through under the cover of the pandemic last year. Of course, the most important one was an amendment waiving the presidential term limit for him personally, not abolishing the term limit, but waiving it for him personally to allow him to stay on in power beyond the end of his current and final mandate after May the 7th, 2024. It is very important that by doing that, Putin crossed the final line. Until now, he was careful, even as he violated the spirit of the law and the Constitution, he was careful to pretend to stick to the letter of it. Just as he did with Medvedev, when he was hit with a term limit the first time, he put in a puppet president. I don't know if anybody still remembers that name, Dmitry Medvedev. He was formerly president of Russia for 4 years, didn't have any power, not even to appoint his own secretary. But formally, Putin didn't violate the term limit then. Now, by doing what he's doing, by ramming through those constitutional amendments that violated every single rule, not just domestically in terms of Russian law, but also in terms of our commitments under the OSCE and the Council of Europe, Russian legislation on how to pass constitutional amendments was violated in several ways. The so-called plebiscite that ratified these amendments was a complete sham and farce with a week-long voting, with no oversight or control, with no international observers, with no independent observers. We can go on and on. This was an absolutely illegitimate and unlawful exercise. And there were two recent important international documents. One, a resolution by the European Parliament that declared those constitutional amendments to be enacted illegally. And secondly, just last week, a very important report by the European Commission on Democracy Through Law, also known as the Venice Commissions, or the main constitutional law body of the Council of Europe, of which Russia obviously is a member, that said that the procedure for enacting these amendments was flawed and totally inadequate. And once again, reiterated the term limits are a necessary barrier to the abuse of power. And so if Putin attempts to stick to his seat beyond midday on May 7th, 2024, he will be becoming illegitimate, not just de facto, but also de jure, and that is an important difference. And apart from everything that means for us domestically in Russia, I think we'll see a lot of protests, a lot of big protests throughout 2024, all over the country. I think this also calls for a very clear and very principled policy of non-recognition on behalf of Western democratic nations of this attempt at a clear usurpation of power, if that is what Putin's going to do in the year 2024. When we talk about the Magnitsky Act, we're talking about the need for financial and economic integrity. When we're speaking about non-recognition of usurpation, there's a clear need for political and moral integrity. And I certainly hope that the leaders of the major Western democratic nations take a principled position and stand on their values as we approach that crucial year of 2024 in Russia.
Thank you very much. And Andrei, any closing thoughts?
Well, I wanted to be very optimistic, and I certainly believe that someday we can see this big change, and that could be, again, absolutely unpredictable. But before that moment, I should stress one thing, that unfortunately, and my area of expertise is Russia's secret services and intelligence agencies. Until that moment of this big change, we can see some more dramatic and adventurous actions from the Russian secret services. They found a way, it seems they found a way, how to adjust to this new climate of being exposed, and they're ready to be exposed and named and shamed by Western journalists and Western security services. They found a way how to adjust to that. That is absolutely clear. They also understand that this new idea, this new concept of inspiring fear by killing people and poisoning them is very effective. And I can say that probably now this comparison with the Soviet Union doesn't work anymore, because in the late Soviet Union, the KGB tried to not to kill people. They tried to be a bit more subtle. And now it's absolutely changed. So this comparison with the Soviet Union doesn't work anymore. It's more Middle Eastern, I would say, or maybe even South American in its approach. So we can expect more actions, both online and offline, because right now but people there in these services, they believe and they think it works.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who tuned in live. And as a reminder, a recording of this conversation will also be available for playback on the Council's social channels and website shortly. And special thank you both to Andrei and Vladimir for joining us on this program today. It was a very interesting discussion. Great to see you both, and it was a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.